Hello and welcome to this bonus video in my Docker course. In this video, I'm going to be deploying the example application from the course. And so that is a 3-tier web app with a React client on the front end, a Node.js and a Golang API talking to a Postgres database, each in their own containerized services. And I'm going to deploy that to Railway, which is a relatively new cloud provider with a pretty slick developer experience. And so I want to showcase the process for taking the configuration that we have and deploying it via Railway. And so if we just go to railway.app, here I have an empty project within Railway, and I'm going to start by adding a Postgres database. So I can just add a new service, choose database, and choose Postgres. That will spin up a copy of Postgres running in the service. One nice feature of Railway is that it makes it very easy to add the database URL or other environment variables associated with the database to other services. I'm going to click New and create an empty service. And I'll be connecting these via the Railway command line. We can also connect via a GitHub repo and deploy on pushes to branches and that sort of thing. I'll show that at the end. But for now, I'll just create 3 new empty services that I'll connect to the services from my application. So I'll rename this one API Node, empty service, API Golang, one more, client React Nginx. My front end, I have a development version that uses Vite and has a development server. However, I'm going to hook up the production-based one that uses an Nginx-based server and builds the front end into a set of static files. I can now jump over to my code editor where I have the repo cloned. And if you don't have it cloned already, it is this DevOps directive Docker course repo. And I'm going to create a new branch called Railway because I know there's a few configuration changes that we'll need to make. So now I'm on the Railway branch. I'll be using the Railway CLI. You can install this in a few different ways. Here's the documentation on it. If you're on a Mac, you can install with brew or npm. If you're on Windows, you can use npm. The easiest way is probably just to use npm and install it globally with this command. So the first thing that I'll do is do Railway login. That'll open a browser and do an authentication flow. I'll do Railway link to connect this to the project that I have set up. I'll choose that one, production environment. And now I can do Railway service to choose which service I'm interacting with. So let's start with the node-based API. We'll navigate to where the source code is in module 5, API node. Now, one limitation I found of Railway is if you're using Docker files, you have to place that Docker file in the same directory that your build context is. So in the course, I was passing a Docker file from module 6 and using a build context from module 5 with a relative path. I wasn't able to get that to work with Railway, so instead what I'll do is copy the Docker file that I have from 6 into my directory in module 5 so that Railway will be able to pick that up. If you don't provide a Docker file, Railway will try to assess the language runtime that you're using and use something called Nixpacks to auto-generate a container image. Since we've already defined the Docker files exactly how we want them, I'm going to go ahead and use it. So I'm going to copy this in. It's going to default to using the name Docker file. If you want to use a different file name for that, you can pass an environment variable to the service within Railway and tell it the name of that new name of the Docker file. But if I just use Docker file, it should detect it automatically. There's also a configuration format that they use called railway.toml. And so I can add a new file here. So I can add a new file to this directory, railway.toml. And within this toml file, I can define a few things. One, I can define the build parameters. And so here I'm telling it to use the Docker file builder. And then, like I was saying, it's going to look for Docker file by default, but I can also say dockerfile.railway. Let's do that just to make it more clear. So I'll rename this. And then I can also specify some deployment configuration, such as the health check path. So I have a route defined on my APIs /ping where it will return a 200 response if the API is healthy. So I can use that. And then this specifies how many times it should try to restart the service if it fails, and when to restart the service. And so with those defined, I'm going to do a Railway up. And because I've already told it that I'm working with the API node service, it's going to take my source code, locally compress and upload it to Railway to build. And it looks like it failed. It looks like it failed because it tries to use Nixpacks here, but let's open this up. And so it's thinking that my root directory for my repo is the root directory for this project when it is for this service when it is not. And instead, that needs to be this O5 example web application API node. And so let me update here this root directory in the UI. I don't think there's an option for that in the railway.toml. And so I'm going to specify that, then click check. Let me rerun Railway up. In the meantime, I will add the root path for the other services as well. So the Golang one, the root directory will be API Golang. And the client React Nginx will be client React. Okay, so it looks like it successfully built this time. It built my container image based on the Docker file I provided. And now when it deploys, it's crashing upon startup because it doesn't have that database URL environment variable defined. So like I was saying earlier, one really slick feature of Railway is that under this variables tab, I can use a variable reference and pull in database URL from my Postgres database. I can click add. That will redeploy my service, and hopefully this time it will boot up successfully. The one other setting that I know I want to change is to generate a domain here. So I could either provide a custom domain or have Railway generate one for me. One current limitation of Railway is that there's no private networking. So whereas with Docker Compose or Docker Swarm, we were using a private overlay network managed by Docker and the DNS set up by Docker to reference our different services. In this case, these are going to be public endpoints that I'll configure my Nginx to proxy to. So when it tried to build with the Docker file, it's saying that cache mounts must be in this particular format. The cache mounts that I'm using in my Docker files are slightly different. I'm not sure why it doesn't allow this doesn't allow this target option, and instead needs an ID. For now, I'm just going to clear out the cache mount. All that does is help improve build speed for iterative builds, where if you change one dependency, it doesn't have to download them all from the internet each time. And so by removing it, it shouldn't actually hurt us that much. I'll remove it from here as well. And now let's do a Railway up once more. I can follow this link, and that should take me right to the logs from this build. Here's the service. It's initializing it's going to build and hopefully deploy successfully this time. While that's building, I'm going to go ahead and make those updates with the cache mount change to the Golang and React services. Let me copy the final Docker file for Golang here. I'll use dockerfile.railway again. I'll remove my cache mounts. Great. I'm going to add that railway.toml for this service. It's going to look quite similar to my node railway.toml. In this case, I'm just passing it a different path to the Docker file. My health check is on the same route, and everything else looks the same. And then for the React client, I'll copy my Docker file. Rename to dockerfile.railway. Create my railway.toml. Fix my typo. Identical to the others except for the path to the Docker file. Let's go check on that node API, see how it's building. It's taking a little while to start. That's okay. Let's go ahead and kick off builds for our other services. So I'll go back to API Golang, Railway service to switch over. I want API Golang, then I'll do a Railway up. I'll do the same for the client React. Railway service, choose client React Nginx, Railway up. I do know that I need to add that database URL here under the variable section. So again, variable reference, database URL, add. I also want to generate a domain for each of these so that I can use them. Perhaps I ran the Railway up from the wrong directory. Let's see. Okay, so now we're getting the logs back from that Railway up command. Why is it not finding /source? Should be there. So to debug, I'm just building it locally to make sure it works, and it does. And so why am I not getting... Let me try running it from the root of my project. Away Interesting. So here it detected the Docker file for the Golang application, deployed it, and appears to be working. If I load it, we get our Golang application, our API returning this JSON response with the current timestamp grabbed from the database. So the Golang application seems okay. Now, why is the Node application failing? It's taken a little while to kick off that build. In the meantime, I do know that I need to update my Nginx configuration for the front end in order for me to talk to these backend services, because I'm now using those public domains rather than the Docker provided DNS settings that I was setting up in my Docker Compose file. And so in order to do that, I have the Nginx configuration here that's getting built in. I'm going to update a few things. Rather than using this API Golang 8080, instead I'll use the domain that we had here from Railway. So I'll copy link address, and I will set that accordingly. So now it will proxy to that address for Golang, and then for Node, let me grab that one. We're still having an issue with our copy command there. I wonder if it has to do with the fact that I have that relative path there and the context is being set as something weird. Let me remove that // and instead just use the source directory here. Do railway up. I'll also kick off a build with that updated Nginx configuration. Oh, and I just noticed that I was using this internal DNS server, this Docker DNS server as the resolver. I'll remove that, and instead I can just put a resolver of localhost here. Railway service. Choose client React Nginx. Railway up. For my client React app, I still had the cache mount set how I had before. So let me remove that. But I'm quite confused as to what is going on here and why it's not finding my source directory. Let me see my Docker ignore. No, that's fine. This Docker ignore looks fine. So it seems to not be finding my source code. I wonder if I didn't save this path properly. Settings. So I wonder if I somehow set this root directory but didn't get it configured, but it didn't get saved or something, because that's the only thing that seems different from this versus the Golang application. So again, let me go here and hit a redeploy. Okay, so that looks like it made the difference. Something about I updated in the UI, but then it didn't save to the backend, and so that's just it looks like a UI bug from Railway. But it looks like now my Node application is functioning. Great. Now we're deploying the front end. It's successfully built here as well. So I think that was the issue, is somehow the root path was, I could see it in the front end, but it hadn't gotten saved. Looks like it's starting up. Because I'm using the unprivileged Nginx image, base image, so if I go here, it's going to be running on port 8080. And so I need to tell Railway that it is listening on port 8080. And so I think I'll need to set that in order for Railway to be able to correctly wire up the ingress traffic to it. I'm going to set port to 8080. Click add. That should redeploy. And now if I visit it, we can see my application running. I'm hitting that front end, that Nginx-based React app. It's pinging my two services, the Golang and Node APIs, and returning those to the front end. And so I've set all this up using the Railway CLI. Let me show you what you need to do to connect it to GitHub so it'll actually build and deploy based on pushes. The only thing we'll need to do there is to go into each of these. And I don't think there's a way to do this via the CLI, but under settings, we'll connect a repo. We'll choose the repo that I've already hooked up. It's connecting. And then the other thing that I'll want to do is to connect an environment. I'll refresh so that I can detect that repo and then change it to, let me push that Railway branch. I'll push all my changes to this Railway branch. Now, if I refresh, I can change this to Railway, and I'll do the same for my other applications. So I'll connect a repo, choose the repo. I believe I need to refresh in order to get the trigger up here at the top, switch that to Railway. And finally, for my React client, connect a repo, choose the repo, refresh, set the trigger to be the Railway branch. Let me just make a trivial change to the code. I'll save that, commit it. Push it. And we should see here in a minute, it's going to detect that change on the Railway branch, rebuild these services, and redeploy. Now if I refresh here, you can see the Node API is mid-deploy right now, so it's not a zero downtime deploy. However, once we update again, we see that that code change that I pushed to GitHub 30, 45 seconds later is now live, and I'm accessing it via the internet. And so you can see how Railway kind of allows you to have local development, push to GitHub, and or directly use the CLI to interface with their cloud-based resources. And so hopefully that gives you an idea of how to use a system like Railway to work with containerized applications. As a reminder, what we did is we spun up a project in Railway. We created that Postgres instance. We then created empty services for our 3 applications. We connected those both via the command line as well as the GitHub repo. And then the rest of it was just configuration modifications. Since we were no longer using our Docker Compose, we needed to configure things in Railway's format. So we used that railway.toml to specify that we wanted to use a Docker file and specifically which path to that Docker file we needed. We had to set the root directory in the UI. And so that actually was something that caught us up a little bit as we had set it, but it hadn't gotten saved properly. But once we did, we were able to successfully build and push those containers and run them. There was that limitation in terms of we had to use a Docker file in the same path as our source code. And so I had to copy from one directory to the other. But in a normal project, you would generally have your Docker file at the same location as your source code anyways, so that shouldn't be an issue. And then we added some environment variables. We added the database URL from the Postgres database. We added the port for the front end because it's not running on port 80. And so by specifying the port environment variable, Railway was able to properly set up the domain. Because we're using those public domains for the APIs, we had to update our Nginx config to talk to those services rather than using the Docker overlay network to talk to them on a private network. Hopefully, having seen this, you'll be able to take your own projects and deploy them with something like Railway and understand the differences between working with Docker Compose or Docker Swarm and working with a system like Railway. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care.